call black everything. Everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're thrilled today to be joined by Professor Prithi Kanakamedala, who's a professor of history at the Bronx Community College, City University of New York system. She joins us today to talk about her just published book, Brooklynites, the remarkable story of the free black communities that shaped a borough, published by our friends at New York University Press. How are you doing today, Professor?
I'm very well, Dr. Neal. How are you?
I'm doing well. Of this wonderful book, Brian Purnell, who's the author of Fighting Jim Crow in the County of Kings, writes, through deep research and fantastic images, Brooklynites presents a powerful portrayal of racism and black struggles for freedom written by a leading public historian and scholar of 19th century America. Read this book and you will never again think the same way about Brooklyn and America's complicated, contradictory, hard-edged, and hopeful history. Again, welcome to Left to Black. So let me start this question, and it's a question that you actually asked in the early parts of the book. Why Brooklyn?
Yeah, sure. So, I've been doing this work for about 15 years, if not a little bit longer now. And no matter where you go in the country and even abroad, people always have a connection to Brooklyn. Brooklyn is a brand in its own right, and it merits its own research. As a historian, I could tell you, Brooklyn was doing something very peculiar in the 19th century, and that is around the history of slavery. So prior to 1898, which is consolidation here in New York City, Brooklyn was its own independent city in the same way that we talk about sort of New York City and LA today. And I really do feel it therefore merits its own sort of research or looking at it upon sort of what's the uniqueness of Brooklyn's history. Brooklyn has a story to tell, as the start of that book goes, and the story is that for so long it was a slaveholding capital. Harold X. Connolly in the 1970s would call it a slaveholding capital that had larger slaveholding numbers than any other county in New York State. And so how Brooklyn came to be really is embedded in that 18th and 19th century history.
You know, it's funny. I'm a hip hop head. So listening to Mos Def's song, Brooklyn, which samples Roy Ayers' song, We Live in Brooklyn, right? And this idea, I'm a New Yorker, right? So growing up and understanding Brooklyn as a borough, I actually went to Brooklyn Tech, right? So I traveled there every day when I was in high school. There was always something about Brooklyn that felt different and unique, right? As if it was its own alien and, own extraterrestrial space.
Yeah.
And the thing that I love about this book is that this book actually puts this in a historical context. But before we get into Brooklyn, I want to talk a little bit about your own intellectual trajectory because you shout out some significant names early in the book, as an explanation for why you do the kind of work that you do. The great Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who of course is your colleague, and the great British thinkers Paul Gilroy and Stuart Hall. Talk a little bit about your intellectual trajectory via these three major figures and voices and thinkers, and how it gets you to the work that you do now.
Oh, thank you so much for the question, Dr. Neal. It's not, as a public historian, a question I get asked a lot, but I do owe a huge intellectual debt. I'm aging myself. I grew up at a time, in the late 70s, early 80s, where seeing Stuart Hall on the BBC on free television was very much part of just normal Saturday programming.
That old sense of cultural values was, of course, for people like me on the margins, profoundly rooted in power. It had to do with economic and political and cultural and class power, had to do with white power, with European power, with colonial power. And the undermining of that, although I think it gives a kind of a sense of the collapse of points of reference to people, and therefore it's a very disturbing period to live through, nevertheless holds out the possibility of other scales of values that have been actively marginalized historically for large numbers of people in the world, beginning to achieve their own valorization.
And honestly, that became my norm, to see cultural thinkers, public intellectuals on TV was really part of the fabric of growing up in Thatcher's Britain. And it's sort of when I got to graduate school, and, you know, I'm that sort of last, I don't know if it's a generation, but certainly that last wave of folks who were really sort of standing on the shoulders of giants and thinking about post-colonial studies and Black studies in Britain. So when I went to graduate school, you know, Homi Bhabha had come out of the University of Sussex, which is where I would do my PhD. And of course, Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy were huge figures. And so that's really what my training was grounded in. The idea that, you know, everything can be explained through cultural theory, through Black studies, through thinking about the world and the solidarities in which we created around various struggles. And so that has always stayed with me. Ruth Wilson Gilmore is a senior colleague here at CUNY, the City University of New York. I have had the honor of sitting in one of her seminars, the CPCP seminar, as we call it here, Culture for Center, Place, and Politics. And I think, you know, Ruthie says it herself that Golden Gulag might be about a different time and a different place, but that it is absolutely modeled on Stuart Hall's work. And I think when, you know, Dr. Wilson Gilmore said that, I think it resonated and just struck so true to the work that I do. My work might be about a different time period, a different set of ancestors or historical actors of New York's past, might even be about a different region. But in terms of my intellectual process and thinking about public engagement, public-facing work, who do we write for, it is absolutely grounded in those three brilliant thinkers.
You know, you mentioned Brooklyn not being a part of New York City until the late 1890s. You know, it's not only a separate city, it's one of the largest cities in the United States, you know, in this period of time. And you tell the story through four families: the Krogers, the Hodgeses, the Wilsons, and the Gluciders. Who are these families and why are they so significant to this story of Brooklynites?
Yes, so the book does tell the story of lots of different people who grew up in Brooklyn or who made Brooklyn their home. The four families, which are, as you mentioned, it's the Krogers, the Hodges, the Wilsons, and the Gloucesters. The reason for doing that is because the book really does cover some dense urban history. It goes from the end of the American Revolution, when Brooklyn was only one of six former colonial towns in Kings County. And at the end of the book, it's the third largest city in the United States. Again, as a committed sort of public historian, I'm always thinking of ways in which, well, how do you tell that story that is crucial to know as New Yorkers and beyond, but actually break it down in a way that invites readers or public audiences in. And so part of doing it in that way was a narrative device. It was to sort of split up these 6 really dense decades of Brooklyn's history and show how each family is coming to this place called Brooklyn and really shaping it around struggles, and not just struggles, but also, you know, dreams that they had for this place that they were going to call home. But the other way to do it was really, I think, an homage and a shout out to the decades of genealogical research that is done right here in New York City and across the country, especially when it comes to Black history in the United States. It was to say that in my mind, in terms of my practice, there is no distinction between the sort of traditional academic history, genealogy, public history, community research, the way we break those things down. But actually, those things have to be in conversation if we really want to tell the story of a place. And so that was really my way of saying, you know, I've been in conversation with genealogists. I've been on panels with them. You know, they're my friends in public history here in the city. And this is sort of my ode or my very small shout out to the work that they do.
How did you, you know, from your intellectual framework, how did Brooklyn become the story that you wanted to tell? I get why the story of Brooklyn needed to be told, but how did you get to that story?
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, I just have to say, so I'm a CUNY professor. My main campus is up in the Bronx at Bronx Community College. And I am so grateful for my Bronx students because as typical New Yorkers, they could care less about Brooklyn. As soon as I open my mouth.
Well, I grew up in the Bronx and went to high school in Brooklyn, right? And I felt the same way traveling there every day. So I get it.
Right. So I think it forces you to answer questions about how you came to things and why you're teaching what you're teaching, or why you're researching or writing about what you're doing. In practical terms, my story really begins in that it was during the Bloomberg administration, just to date how old public history projects begin and start and how they have afterlives. The Bloomberg administration were looking to tear down housing in downtown Brooklyn. That was called Duffield Street. Today it's called Abolitionist Place. And what they did was they did tear down the houses anyway, but there was one woman in particular, the late Mama Joy Chattel, who really fought for her house to be preserved. So thinking about, public history in action, there it was.
New York was the second largest slave-owning state in the nation. The second largest. South Carolina was the first. I thought once you came north, you were free, but we were not free. And there's no museums.
Like everything else in New York City, of course, development happened anyway. But what they did was send in an RFP to cultural organizations in Brooklyn to really tell what was then, I have to say, 15 years ago. It can't be said today. There's a proliferation of books about Brooklyn today around Brooklyn's history. So it was then Brooklyn Historical Society, which no longer exists. It's now Center for Brooklyn History at Brooklyn Public Library. Weeksville Heritage Center, which still very much exists, thriving today, and are stewards of that original historic community here in Brooklyn. And then Irondale Ensemble Project, which was a theater company. So my sort of journey or invitation to this research was a job post-PhD, researching and writing and thinking in public ways about how we both do this history and this research, and then how we disseminate it to the public in community engaged or public facing projects.
And in a period of time when it's literally being erased.
Yes,
right. So it's a recovery project very much,
it
right?
Is. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Neal. It is. And that's why I constantly say it is recovery, right? It is about really restoring a history that was not being told. Not that it was lost, like it was always there in the archives, but for whatever reason, and I think part of it's to do with there were a wave of scholars, and absolutely no diss to anybody, who were calling themselves New York City historians, but their focus really was Manhattan. And so that's why I say when I started, with the exception of Dr. Craig Stephen Wilder up at MIT, whose book Covenant with Color, of course, did a lot of that work, and a wave of scholars that I do think academia kind of left out, Robert Swan, Harold X. Connolly, Dr. Joan Maynard, all of these figures were doing this work around Brooklyn in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. But there was no definitive, here is the history of Brooklyn. So when I began on the project, that was sort of my intro to it, right? I was going to be the public historian who would both put together this history, always acknowledged, I'm a Scouser. I grew up in England, Liverpool, England. Those are my proud roots, a Desi Scouser. So always sort of saw it as, well, whose shoulders am I standing on to tell this story? Who am I in constant dialogue with? Getting rid of that sort of classic 90s graduate school model, which was always the intervention model, right? Like here's all the literature, here's all the historiography, and here's the intervention I'm making. But actually, it's not an intervention. It is a acknowledgement. It is a shout out. It is a really sort of homage to everything that has come before. And here I am. I am just the latest person who's going to add something to this story. And guess what? In 10 years, it will be somebody else. And that's the joy of doing public history. Why is a Desi Scouser doing Brooklyn's history? As somebody who grew up in a port city, again, aging myself, late 70s, early 80s, I teach in New York City history today at CUNY, and I can tell you there are so many parallels in between sort of New York City and what happened in Liverpool. There's a reason Reagan and Thatcher were such good friends, right?
Yeah.
What they did to communities of color and Black communities in the cities in that late 70s, early 80s, you could be telling the same story, the history of police brutality, of union busting, of the loss of our cities, the loss of those waterfront jobs that were crucial to working class communities, and what happens after. Liverpool really was the city that got forgotten, and what mutual aid organizing therefore looks like in a working class city. Again, when I tell the history of 19th century Brooklyn or 19th century New York, it's the same history. It is about ordinary people figuring out how to organize, how to mobilize, and really create home and create place.
And I mean, as you mentioned this, given where you are located as a scholar, as a professor, what does it mean for you at this stage in your career to really commit to doing work, to teaching, to mentoring the kind of students that go through the city university system? The work that you've done, you could have easily been at a Ivy League place, one of these small, wonderful liberal arts schools that don't seem to have any problems. And I'm sure part of the appeal is living in New York. So I get that part of it, right? But for you, what does that mean in terms of your commitment to those students, those working class, those working poor students, for which this really is an opportunity for them in ways that it might not ring the same way for some of the more privileged students going to more privileged institutions?
Yeah, thank you for the question again. It's everything. I mean, honestly, I've been at CUNY for 12 years now, and teaching this material never gets old to me. And again, I say it in the book, in the acknowledgement section, like Dr. Wilson Gilmore, this might be about a set of Brooklynites that lived in Brooklyn in a very specific time period. But my students' voices up in the Bronx and what we have been talking about for the last decade and a half is throughout. How they are the recipients of structural inequality, structural racism, of everything that has come before. All of that is weaved throughout. I just feel as though, there's so much around, I'm a public historian right now in academia, or I do public something. In my mind, if that's not happening in terms of teaching New Yorkers, right? That's what we do at CUNY. We teach New Yorkers every day. Then I have no right to call myself a public historian, because who is my public at that point?
Yeah. One of the things that's wonderful about this book, besides the extraordinary history that you tell, but the illustrations of maps, right? Getting a sense of the lay of the land, for what Brooklyn is. And, we think about what downtown Brooklyn looks like now. We think about Barclay, the Barclay Center, right? We think about Dumbo, right? This place that has become like this kind of imaginary place for wealth. And one of the things that you talk about is that many of these places and spaces that we think of in contemporary Brooklyn were places where Black folks lived, right? 150 years ago. Talk a little bit again and more about this kind of physical erasure of the presence of Black people in Brooklyn.
Yeah, it's huge. It's persistent. It's across New York City. It's not unique to Brooklyn. I think the tragedy of it is of the boroughs that gentrified so quickly. Williamsburg, whether you're an urban planner, urban historian, it's always the example, isn't it? In North Brooklyn, Williamsburg was one of the first neighborhoods to gentrify. And I think that loss of Black life, of Black political life that was organizing as early as, 1805 in Williamsburg. Williamsburg was one of the largest free Black communities in New York City, if you include Manhattan. We talk about Seneca Village, we talk about Weeksville, which we must talk about. But again, there were all these pockets. It was folks of African descent who were figuring out what freedom was, and how do we create communities and institutions so that we can thrive, that is beyond that white lens, right? That is about self-determination. And so absolutely, when you see downtown Brooklyn and Dumbo, I don't live in Brooklyn anymore. I got priced out by most folks in New York City. So I live in a different borough. But when I go back, to do these talks or just to walk around, walking, so well, is a political act as much as it is an act of relaxation. It's an act of reconnecting with the land. I'm always blown away by how much development is erasing in real time without any sort of commemorative plaques or ideas of what that land was. I think the beauty as a historian of what you can always remind New Yorkers of is that we are constantly walking over the land, the achievements, the contributions, the labor of New Yorkers past, even if you can't see it, right? And that's what those maps are about in that book, that land has always existed, and that before you, somebody else was doing something that might remind you of a similar struggle that you're in today, or it might remind you of the kind of hope that we can have in terms of the kind of city we want to see. So absolutely, this book deliberately and intentionally does include Weeksville and Seneca Village. But its focus really is the kinds of neighborhoods that we might not associate with Black life today. Even somewhere like Fort Greene, you know, as a young person growing up in the 90s, Fort Greene, and seeing that Renaissance movement, to me, was sort of the center of Black Brooklyn and cultural activity.
Right. Spike Lee and all those folks. Yep.
Yeah, but today, I don't know that it's got those same claims. So again, a kind of love letter, I think, to the ways in which people of color, women of color like myself, owe a gratitude to folks from the past who came before us, were of African descent, were doing this kind of organizing.
Yeah, I'd be lying if I said that if I could time travel, I wouldn't find someplace to borrow $10,000 and go back to Williamsburg in 1979 and buy some property, right? Because, you know, just extraordinary to see in a generation the way some of these places and spaces have been transformed, and not for the better of the people who live there, right? Which is kind of the bottom question. So talk a little bit about August 1, 1841. And I'm reading this and I'm like, the West India Emancipation Day, and because I'm stuck on the Indian piece, and then I'm like, oh, West Indian, right? And while there's no connection between the, you know, this Emancipation Day in August of 1941 and say the West Indian Day Parade that we all know and love, right, in 2025, right, you do see some interesting continuity here. So talk a little bit about what this Emancipation Day was in 1841.
Yes, absolutely. So in Brooklyn's history, there are two Emancipation Days that were celebrated. One is the more obvious one. It's the July 4th, 1827, which is the end of slavery in New York.
In New York State. Right.
No Black New Yorker or Black Brooklynite was celebrating on that day, though. They make July 5th, 1827, the day of Emancipation Day. And that's when you see, or you read rather today, these beautiful accounts of, you know, Black communities really celebrating joy. Sort of away from a white lens who, you know, everybody else is celebrating at July 4th, and creating a political statement around what emancipation looks like. The second emancipation moment that you see is that August 1st, 1841. You know, when we began this project, I remember sort of folks who worked at the museum then thinking, we're doing Brooklyn, are we being too parochial, or like, is this looking too local history? And I always think there's great pride in local history. I don't see that as a negative. And honestly, I'm always like, well, it's not really local Brooklyn. You know, when I go home to Liverpool, I see T-shirts in like very mainstream stores with Brooklyn emblazoned across it. I wouldn't say this is like, you know, the history of some small town in the Midwest. This is a major place. And so just to say, you know, Brooklynites saw their city in the same way that we see them today. New Yorkers, quite rightly, think of themselves as citizens of the world. Yeah. And so Brooklynites, again, were making sort of remarkable arguments around what freedom looked like. And freedom to them was not absolute just because they were legally free people in the United States living in Brooklyn. It was always about the argument that as long as people, their brothers and sisters in the South were unfree, that nobody was truly free. And, you know, we know this, again, going back to sort of Paul Gilroy's ideas around the Black Atlantic, that Black people were always making those connections across oceans and seas, right? So thinking about what was happening in Haiti that had shown them a model for what Black liberation looks like. And thinking about Jamaica, the West Indian Day, Emancipation Day celebration really is about the British leaving the Caribbean. And again, making those connections. If the British can leave the Caribbean, and that is sort of touted as, you know, a sort of bastion of Western progress or civilization, whatever that means. And we're creating these parks like Central Park, like Prospect Park, so that we are, you know, rivaling those parks in Europe. Then what does freedom mean in this context if we don't have it? So again, Black Brooklynites are making these brilliant connections around freedom looking like a global struggle. Way before Marcus Garvey, thinking about what does a Back to Africa movement look like? What does a pan-diasporic movement look like? And so that's what the West India Day Emancipation celebrations were. And what Kings County had access to a lot of was land, right? So unlike Manhattan, where they're all sort of living in a very sort of cramped urban space.
Right, landlocked, yep.
Yeah, exactly. Brooklynites were going out further east and celebrating during the hot summer month, August 1st. We know this when we live in New York. It is hot. It is sticky. Like, people have a very short sort of temper around that time. And there's no air conditioning, right? So they're going to places that still have a lot of trees, are cool, are not urban developed yet, and are gathering and are just celebrating themselves around what it means to create community.
You talk in the book about how education was vital to the concept of freedom for these folks. Talk about the African and or colored schools that began to emerge as part of Brooklyn's own idea of public education in that period of time.
Sure. So education is crucial. You know, I myself am an educator. I do this exercise every semester with my students. If you could create the perfect community, what organizations or institutions exist? And students will always say, without fail, school, right? And sometimes it's a church, but I feel as though we're moving away from that idea. It's always the community center. It is usually open space or public land that people can gather in. And I would say that theme of education being a mode of emancipation or liberation is a long, long line here in Brooklyn, as it is in most Black history in the United States. The issue came up in Brooklyn specifically because when the first public school was created in 1814, there is an ad in the newspaper, in the Long Island Star, which is Brooklyn's sort of major newspaper. And it says, Black children will not be welcomed at this time due to space restrictions. And so you have that the beginning of public education in Brooklyn is very much rooted in structural racism. And again, Black Brooklynites are not waiting to be invited to this freedom movement, right? They're not waiting to be invited to what's 1827 going to look like. I would say that's what makes this the Brooklyn story. Self-determination is at the center of Brooklyn always. Whereas you have examples of white philanthropy in Manhattan, especially with the start of that African free school system. There's no example of it in Brooklyn. It is two brothers, Benjamin and Peter Kroger, and the book argues enough about sort of the history of men, but actually they had wives and that it was their homes too. So the school begins in Peter Kroger's home, which was on James Street. That street no longer exists. It was raised when Brooklyn Bridge was created. And in my mind, you know, that's how sort of the archives, state it's Peter Kroger's home. And that is how, you know, some historians have written about that history. But in my mind, if that was his home, that was also Eleanor Kroger's home. Eleanor Kroger was his wife, lived there. And I think, you know, scholars like P. Gabrielle Foreman have told us or invited us in to think about that larger family unit. Especially around the Black conventions, you know, what was happening when these men were gathering? What were women doing? More importantly, what happened to the children? What were the kinds of stories they were hearing from their parents? And so again, sort of in honor of that kind of methodology, I wanted to open it up and say, yes, the archive might say it's Peter Kroger's home, but this was absolutely the home of a Black woman too, and thinking about the ways in which Eleanor Kroger would have created space in that home. And so that is the start of the African school system. It is a private enterprise that begins in the home of Peter Kroger, a free Black man living here in Brooklyn. It then, like so many other histories in other sort of U.S. cities, becomes enmeshed in the Black church. The oldest Black church in Brooklyn is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It's founded in 1818, so just 2 years after Richard Allen finds it in Philadelphia. And so, again, education becomes crucial to the church and faith, and the school will move to the basement of the church. Just to fast forward, what happens so often still in New York City's history and today, when the Brooklyn Board of Education starts to formalize it in the 1840s and gets involved and moves out Black leadership, that is when the problems in the schools start to emerge. They will be renamed Color School 1, 2, and 3, one in downtown Brooklyn, one in Weeksville, one in Williamsburg. And you see the same issues. You know, my partner is a DOE educator, and he complains about the same things: overcrowding, lack of resources, not enough time to do anything. Money that was promised by the city didn't materialize in these classrooms. It is all the same themes that happen in Black education here in Brooklyn.
I'm a big fan of the HBO series, The Gilded Age. the great work that our colleague Erica Dunbar is doing on that show, inserting the story of Black folks into this context, right? And much of the story, of course, is about these rich Gilded Age folks in Manhattan. But when the show talks about Black people, it talks about Brooklyn. You don't write about the Gilded Age, right? You kind of cut this story off before then. I mean, you just mentioned Brooklyn Bridge. Brooklyn Bridge doesn't open until 1883, right? But it's already destroying Black communities before we even get to that opening. Talk a little bit about this legacy of the period of Brooklyn that you write about, the Black elites who emerge, right, who become much more of the forefront during the Gilded Age, right? And what it says now in terms of the legacy of contemporary Black Brooklyn. I know that's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, thank God for Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. I mean, the work that she is doing on that show is phenomenal. Truly public history work, right, in real time. And for somebody like myself, I'm always geeking out when there's like a Sarah Smith Tompkins Garnett. I was like, yes, she made it. She's in there. She's commemorated. So the book deliberately does drop at the sort of start of Reconstruction and where the Gilded Age will take off, intentionally so. My point was not to do, and I know some sort of members of the public have said this, they're like, it's like the prologue to the Gilded Age. I'm like, it is kind of, yes. Yeah. It is to show thematic concerns that will remain throughout, but just going back to the idea as a parent myself of what do we leave the next generation? So if think of the Gilded Age as that next generation, what were they sort of the holding up in terms of legacy and having to carry forward as that next generation, thinking about Black women's voting rights, thinking about what it would now look like in which, something like white supremacy in the South through the KKK was formalized, and what it meant to now address lynching in the South, all of that. It really was to talk about, well, that kind of work was always happening. And so the book really does stop with Maritcha Lyons being friends with Ida B. Wells, and thinking about those issues and thinking about the ways in which she was honoring the organizing that her parents had done. So very deliberate, absolutely. That story is being told in the Gilded Age. And so I didn't want to ever feel like, well, this is the historical companion to it. Again, in my mind, art and, history and literature are all in conversation. So yeah, I do leave readers there to say, here's everything that happened and here's the struggle that was going to happen. And what I didn't write in the book was, and I should just go watch the Gilded Age to see how it turns out.
What's next for you?
Oh gosh, Dr. Neal. Well, it's the start of the semester here at CUNY, so I am teaching, very much so. So that's where my brain's at. In terms of writing, as a public historian, I'm consulting on a bunch of projects here in the city. Kenseth Armstead, who is a brilliant visual artist, is doing a public art piece around Duffield Street. It's now called Abolitionist Place. He's creating a commemorative piece to remember that artwork. So I've been brought in as sort of the nerdy or dorky historian. He does not need me. I am honestly just the sideshow. Just like, okay. But I'm doing that. And in terms of writing, I'm writing about the DeGrasse family, who were a family who lived in Manhattan in the early 19th century. George DeGrasse, Carla Peterson writes about him, Craig Wilder writes about him, lists himself on the census in 1850 as being from Calcutta, India. And so finally, I think some of my own roots, thinking about what it means to create solidarities, what racialization looks like, what it meant to be a New Yorker in the early 19th century. That is my next project. I'm looking at that family, trying to figure out the descendants, because that's such an important part and crucial part to me. Yes, a sort of biography, cultural history, and looking specifically at the DeGrasse family of the city of New York.
We've been joined today by Professor Prithi Kanakamedala.
Thank you.
She is the author of Brooklynites, the remarkable story of the free Black communities that shaped the borough, published by NYU Press. We are, in fact, label mates. So it's always nice to talk to fellow NYU authors. Thank you for joining us today, Professor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neal, for having me.
Blacks, they be hyping, I'm the light that lit your match. A black watch for all the times I watch MTV raps. Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black. Culture